assess her punishment at confinement in the Institutional Division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for 25 years.
Susan Wright stands looking stunned. The prosecution team urged the jury to sentence Wright to prison for at least 45 years, but they still considered this sentence just.
9 members of the jury that found Susan Wright guilty of murder took turns telling reporters how they agreed upon the punishment of 25 years in prison.
The way we arrived at the 25 years was just a systematic discussion, round table, and we ironed out our differences. We made compromises, which is what is expected.
Susan was shocked, disappointed, but she accepts, and she also respects the jury verdict.
You filed one appeal of the actual verdict, correct? And that was unsuccessful. But you also filed an appeal of her sentence. On what were the grounds?
And again, the primary question in that first appeal was, as we've talked about, the spectacle, the drama, the unfair prejudice of the bed. Filed a discretionary appeal with the Court of Criminal Appeals, lost that. Then coming back to do the writ of habeas corpus, which is the last-ditch appeal, I claimed that Susan's 2 trial lawyers, Neil Davis and Todd Ward, dropped the ball, were ineffective by failing to present, among other things, an expert to talk about battered women syndrome, and calling a woman who it was remarkable in so many ways, and I'm being understated, a woman named Misty McMichael, who had dated Jeff, to testify as to Jeff's violent character.
So the claim was you should have had, what, more witnesses that came forward that could potentially bolster her claim?
So what happened at the hearing in connection with our post-conviction writ, additional witnesses were called, multiple experts on battered women syndrome, the psychiatrist who Susan had seen, and then Mr. McMichael, who testified as to Jeff's violent character. But once we concluded the evidentiary hearing in front of Judge Jim Wallace, the case went to the Court of Criminal Appeals, and I believe in October of 2009, a unanimous Court of Criminal Appeals ordered a new sentencing hearing.
It's almost like 2 trials. You have the guilt or innocence trial, then you have the punishment trial. That way, as you say, when they changed the law, you didn't have to do both of them again.
Exactly.
You simply could do the sentencing phase again.
Exactly. The plan was, at that point, that I was going to be involved as co-counsel at the new sentencing hearing. The problem was that it didn't work out the way that I had thought. There were some hurt feelings. There were some allegations tossed about who had promised what to whom.
You met with Susan.
Multiple times.
You looked her in the eye. Talk about those conversations, because at some point you have to ask, okay, you did do this, whether it was an act of self-defense or, as the prosecution said, an act to get a $200,000 life insurance policy. Those discussions had to have been had. What was that like, looking into her eyes, having to discuss that?
Well, I can't discuss conversations that we had. Those remain privileged. But obviously, as part of my investigation, I spent considerable time with Susan. And I remember the first time that I met with Susan was in the fall of 2004. I remember it was right around the Jewish holidays. And I got in my car and I made the 3.5-hour trip outside of Waco to her unit. And she still looked so much like an attractive West Houston housewife. Prison had not yet worn her down as it ultimately did, because when you look at the comparison, the contrast between Susan during the first trial and Susan during the post-conviction writ hearing and the second sentencing hearing, it's like, you know, from A to Z. Susan was so mild-mannered that it was difficult for me to reconcile what it would have taken for someone like Susan to have acted as she did that night in 2003. It's, to me, one of the great conundrums in 45 years of practice, the difference in persona and personality and character between the Susan Wright whom Kelly Siegler described and the Susan Wright who I spent so much time with.
In final arguments, prosecutor Connie Spence told jurors it all comes down to credibility, Susan Wright's credibility.
She lies to get away with murder.
Prosecutors insist Wright coldly stabbed her husband almost 200 times as he slept following a round of lovemaking. Killed him, buried him, then tried to cover up the killing, claiming he'd abused her and their children.
After she killed him because she claims that she had no alternative but to kill a sleeping man, why didn't she call the police?
This was a divorce by homicide. Susan Wright was not a battered woman.
You don't stab somebody 193 times for no reason.
But Wright's attorneys urged jurors to reduce her sentence to 10 years probation and time served. They say the evidence proves Jeff Wright was abusive.
And you find out that she had black eyes, she had bruises, she had the usual things that come about with the darkest secret of our lives, which is domestic abuse.
So I ultimately moved to withdraw, and Susan had a new defense team that ended up at the new punishment hearing getting her 20, a reduction of 5 years, 60 months, which is still
right, because the
substantial.
original punishment was 25 years.
Correct. And
then they got that down, they knocked 5 years off of that?
They did.
I mean, I get it. If you're in prison, even a month off your end of your sentence must feel like a gift, but 5 years doesn't seem like a lot. I mean, through all that appellate work, an entirely new sentencing phase, basically to come up with a difference of 5 years really doesn't seem like much.
It does if you're Susan Wright, because every day, every hour, every minute that you spend as a ward of the state is something that is just not quantifiable, but is something you will never be able to get back.
I think I did something awful.
Later this week, the Lifetime Network will air a movie called The Blue-Eyed Butcher, based on Susan Wright's case.
Let's do it.
And just this past weekend, Local 2 Investigates has learned a producer with the Dr. Phil Show contacted Wright by email, requesting an interview to see how she was coping with the death of her children. A curious question, since her children aren't dead.
That's the cruelest damn thing you could ever tell anybody, is that their loved ones have been killed.
Susan Wright, incarcerated near Waco and now 35 years old, has no legal rights to her children, ages 13 and 10. They were adopted by one of Jeff Wright's family members, and we're told she rarely sees them. But by all accounts, she loves them, misses them, and lives for them. Hearing erroneous news of their deaths and not knowing any better for days, according to our source in the prison system, was agonizing. Kevin Conboy, Jeff Wright's friend, labels it just another bizarre chapter in a heartbreaking case.
They're the ones who truly lose. I mean, they lost a mother and they lost a father.
I'm guessing you don't agree with that title.
Not at all. And I remember that the original title was Killing Mr. Wright. I did a movie review, and I remember saying that this movie was so bad on so many levels that it made Showgirls look like Citizen Kane.
When was the last time you did speak to Susan?
Wow, that's a great question. The last time I spoke to her, as you and I are speaking, was on the day that I withdrew from representing her.
How'd that conversation go?
She was surprised. She was shocked to see that I was withdrawing after having expended as much time and as much energy and as much capital as I had. But it was something that had to happen. That was the last time that we physically saw each other. We communicated in the mail probably 5 or 6 years ago. Susan was coming up for parole and was being unsuccessful, and so she reached out to me and wanted me to write a letter of recommendation to the parole board, which I thought was a monumental ask. And
did you?
I did what I could to assist her, but
what does that mean exactly? What could you do to assist her?
I could provide context, explanation from 35,000 feet, and again, filling in the gaps on the canvas as opposed to what the parole board itself might see. And that's the last time that we had any communication. When Susan made parole...
Did you support her parole?
Yes.
Okay. Why?
Because I think she had done more than enough time, considering what it was that a jury had found her guilty of, and the amount of time that she had served. I think the concern that Susan had was she would come up for parole, she'd get rejected, and she was going to get what inmates call a serve-all, which literally means you serve all your sentence. And so when she walked out of her unit in Gatesville, New Year's Eve day, I want to say
2020, I believe.
Please don't do this to my family. Please stop. Have a heart, please.
16 years after her conviction, found guilty of killing her husband, Susan Wright is home.
Certainly. Is there anything that y'all would want to say?
No, ma'am. I would just like privacy. Please respect that.
Wright asked for privacy just as she arrived, some 3 hours after her release this morning from Gatesville Women's Facility.
Susan ultimately spent 17 and a half years as a ward of the state in one of the toughest women's units in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Yeah, she killed another human being. She paid her price, but at the end of the day, I think that no human being should ever suffer the way Jeff suffered. But I can understand what drove Susan to act as she did on that night in March of 2003.
From an outsider's perspective, I would have to ask, are you positive of that? Because some would say, well, that's what she claimed because her life was literally on the line.
I think I can answer it this way, Robert. Do I think that Susan Wright, who never got as much as a speeding ticket or an overdue library book, do I think Susan Wright got up that morning and decided that she was going to end Jeff's life by stabbing him 193 times because of some nonsensical, evanescent life insurance policy? Hell no. But I think what you need to understand is context, that events such as this don't happen in a vacuum. And as we've said very early on, nobody knew what went on inside of Susan and Jeff's house. And I'm telling you, and I believe that Susan Wright was a battered spouse. There's a reason why 2 decades later, we're still talking about this case. I've probably done more media on this case over the last 2 decades than on any case I've ever been involved in. I've represented some pretty high-profile people. Former House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. I was part of Adrian Peterson's defense team, former NFL All-Pro. Won, 100 different appeals and post-conviction writs, but there was something about this case.
Well, what do you think it is?
I think it's the fact that, and this is what I've said, that Susan Wright could have been anyone's daughter, anyone's sister, anyone's wife. And that when we think of a crime of this magnitude on so many different levels, I think in our own mind's eye, we have a stereotypical picture of, Cruella de Vil. Susan Wright was not Cruella de Vil. Susan Wright was not Lizzie Borden. Susan Wright was an attractive, soft-spoken housewife and mom of 2 in West Houston who, in a moment of terror, in a moment of madness, in a moment of survival, at least that's my take, did what she had to do.
Brian, thank you very much for being here. I know you're our legal analyst and you're always there when we need you, but I do appreciate you coming in and providing greater context and detail to this case that I think a lot of people do still have questions about.
Robert, it's a pleasure being here.
That does it for our episode this week. Thank you for joining us. We're back next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. with the case of the Sunday morning slasher. Carl Eugene Watts very nearly became the only confessed serial killer in U.S. history to walk out of prison had it not been the families of the victims and Houston Crime Stoppers Andy Kahn launching a nationwide campaign. Watts very well may have been a free man.
Watts told graphic stories describing when, where, and how he killed young women in Houston.
Of the 9 cases that we now attribute to him because of the information that he's provided us.
He had three ways that he killed his victims. It was stabbing, strangulation, and drowning. He never sexually assaulted anybody, and if he took anything, they were very small trinkets for trophies. So robbery was not a motive as well. He was simply a cold-blooded killing machine.
We'll show you how they were able to keep him behind bars. Again, we stream The Evidence Room every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. You can also catch up on past episodes by downloading the KPRC2 Plus app. And if you have a case you'd like us to examine, please call our tip line at 713-223-TIPS or send us an email. We'll see you next Wednesday.